when he's out there tweeting literally in all caps, "Stop talking about Epstein," if you wanted to create a conspiracy theory, it would be hard to do better than this. He couldn't be looking more guilty if he tried. And maybe that's some brilliant five-dimensional chess thing going on, but I kind of doubt it. Hello, and thank you for joining us. Welcome to a new episode of Power and Flower. I am Seth Maskett.
And I'm John Hagner.
We are a political scientist and a political consultant who are trying to understand and explain what's going on in U.S. politics, and we also care deeply about pastries. Today, we're going to talk about the subject everyone's talking about, Jeffrey Epstein. More specifically, we want to talk about the extent to which the Epstein story is politically damaging to President Trump among his MAGA base. To be honest, I'm pretty disgusted by this whole topic. There's this super conspiratorial version of it in which Trump or people close to Trump have Epstein murdered in his prison cell in 2019 to keep him from naming Trump as a close friend and a regular visitor to his harem of underage girls. The more benign version is that the only thing Trump did wrong is have non-consensual sex with children. That's the benign version. None of this is pretty. But that aside, if we can set that aside, the idea that there is a government cover-up of Jeffrey Epstein as a leader in a global pedophile conspiracy has been a motivating force within the MAGA movement really since its beginnings. It's closely tied to the QAnon movement. It's one of those alleged conspiracies that Trump and his team vowed to blow the doors open on once he returned to office. Vice President Vance called for the files to be revealed. So did Speaker Mike Johnson. Attorney General Pam Bondi said she was about to review these files for release back in February. And then suddenly, earlier this month, Trump says the files are not going to be released, and he yelled at Republicans calling for their release, saying that they were dupes. Now, there hasn't been a whole lot of direct evidence offered for this, but quite a few interviews with longstanding Trump supporters suggest that they have been truly heartbroken and angered by this, and that this has created a rift between Trump and his supporters in a way that really nothing else has done previously. This is what we want to get into today. To what extent is there really a rift? To what extent has Trump been able to pave over that rift over the last week? What role does journalism play in all this? What could or should Democrats be doing in this situation? So, John, if I may, my first question to you is, what evidence do we have that there actually is a rift between Trump and his MAGA base?
Yeah, I think the best time, this is the first time I think in a long time we have seen Republicans telling pollsters, at least, that they are unhappy with something that the Trump administration is doing. That is really unusual in the now very long history of Trump running the Republican Party. The Quinnipiac asked voters what they thought about Trump's handling of the Epstein files in the Trump administration, and 60% of Republicans said either that they were unhappy with it or that they refused to offer an opinion. Less than 40% said that they were happy with it, which that is shocking for Trump. And we don't see that on any other issue that you poll hardcore partisan Republicans. Among independents, it was even more lopsided. And I think it's worth remembering Trump did very well with independents in the last election. So, a lot of those independents are Trump voters who are unhappy with what they're doing. It was 73-11 in terms of approval rating among independents on the handling of the Epstein files. So this is the first issue in a really long time where we have seen some Republicans being willing to say, we don't like it. There's also a lot of Republicans who are just refusing to offer an opinion on this, which is, I think, a safe place for dissatisfied people who still think of themselves as Trump loyalists to go. So that's where you see in the voting group. There's also a lot of sort of elite Republicans who have come out and said that this is nonsense. You've got Elon Musk, who said very bluntly that Trump is in the Epstein files and that's why they have not been released. He deleted that tweet, but now he's been making jokes alluding to that on Twitter. You've got Thomas Massie and a couple other House Republicans who are willing to come out and call for these files to be released. You have a lot of influencers and talking heads and sort of Republican celebrities, for lack of a better word, saying that they were lied to, that they were deceived, and again, that kind of open rebellion with the Trump administration is very rare. I think that one of the hallmarks of the Trump era has been whatever Trump says goes, and people are willing to forget or erase or hide or turn around on issues that they may have cared about before when Trump says to. And this seems to be the first thing in a long time where that isn't working. And I think some of it is, there's a really long history of allegations of child sex abuse being really emotional, and it's something that you can go back to the you know anti-Semitic panics and the witch trials, and as long as we have records of these things, people get really emotionally involved in stories about children being harmed. It's not an easy
Mm.
thing to turn on and off, and even when there's not necessarily any evidence that what is happening is true, it's such an emotionally charged topic that I think it's hard for people to simply walk away from.
Yeah. I I think that's a good summary. There was an interview a few days ago with Nick Fuentes, white supremacist, longstanding, sort of alt right Trump ally, who's been backing him since the beginning. And he was like just apparently really disgusted by this whole thing. And he said, here's a quote from him: "When we look back on the history of populism in America, we are going to look back on the MAGA movement as the biggest scam in history. And the liberals were right. The MAGA supporters were had. They were." Um, uh, I don't know if that many Trump allies have been that, straightforward and eloquent about it, but like
Yeah.
there's been a lot of that out there. And so like if people, if they rely on, on opinions made by elites, by people they trust, those are usually pretty unified within the Trump universe. And here you have some pretty prominent people saying things like that. They get a signal that, okay, this is actually bad.
Yeah, that this is actually bad, because I do think that, like, the QAnon conspiracies had Jeffrey Epstein was really central to, and the QAnon conspiracies had a larger audience than I wish were true. But it's not a majority of the Republican Party. But even folks who don't buy into that, children in shipping containers and celebrities drinking their blood and Guantanamo secret prisons, there's a lot that's really fishy about the story, right? That
Right.
the he got a sweetheart deal from someone who then the Trump administration later promoted to a really high position. The evidence that has been put out, there are conspicuous gaps in it, and there are missing minutes in the footage. And I am not a conspiracy minded person, but I think that something is very strange here. I think that it's not crazy to believe it, and that idea was really central to the Trump movement. And the whole idea that the elites are out to get you, and that there's different rules for fancy rich people than there are for regular folks. I think you really can't understate how important that has been to Trump's electoral success, and then just have somebody kind of hand wave it away and say, there's nothing to see here, you're idiots for caring about this. I think strikes at the emotional heart of why people support Trump in the first place.
Yeah. And particularly like when he's out there tweeting literally in all caps, "Stop talking about Epstein." If you wanted to create a conspiracy theory, it would be hard to do better than this.
Yeah.
He couldn't be looking more guilty if he tried. And maybe that's some brilliant five-dimensional chess thing going on, but I kind of doubt it.
I kind of doubt it
Um,
too. And some people were doing sentiment analysis. Like on Truth Social, the majority of the replies to him were negative, which he built Truth
hmm.
Social to be a place
it's,
to tell him that he
it's
was
his own
brilliant.
channel. Yes,
Exactly. Um, like that's like getting booed at your own birthday party. Like these are his people.
I've done
And
that. I've done that.
yeah.
But yeah, okay.
Yeah, and it's really, I think that we're starting to see his like rage tweeting, like, stop talking about this, feels like someone who's used to getting his way no longer getting his way, and being really surprised that the machine he built to tell him that he's brilliant is breaking down. And I don't know how this is going to survive the summer, if the story is going to stay alive. The administration is clearly realizes that they have a problem, and they've asked some courts to redact a few very specific things. I think we'll see if the courts play along with that, if that helps, or even if just the switch, they're no longer saying nothing will be shown. They're saying, we want to show you things, but our hands are tied. And, you know, the MAGA true believers are not the smartest people in the world. Maybe they will believe that. It doesn't seem like, if you are actually paying attention, I don't think that that's enough, but it might help a little bit. But, I think just the fact that there is an issue where the Republican base is willing to say, hey, we're being lied to, I think could have repercussions in our politics.
Yeah. Yeah, we have seen some efforts by them to try and at least distract from this or to remind the base what they like about Trump in the first place. We've seen suddenly the White House is, producing a bunch of other files on Martin Luther King, on Hillary Clinton, on Samantha Power. They're trying to get people to focus on anything else. We'll see if that works. I'm actually curious, like what, if there actually is a rift here.
Yeah.
Um, and if that goes on for some time, like what does that actually mean? Like obviously these supporters are really important to Donald Trump. They have stood by him when a lot of other political figures would run and hide throughout a ton of other scandals. They've
Yeah.
always stood for him. What if they're not there for him? How do you see this playing out in that
Yeah,
situation?
I think it's a really interesting question. I think the biggest impact that it could have in the 2026 midterm elections, uh, as we've talked about a bunch of times on the show, we're seeing this partisan realignment. That one of the consequences is that the most reliable midterm voters are older, college educated, more affluent people, and they have been trending Democratic at the same time that. Younger, less affluent, less educated folks have been trending toward Trump, who are less likely to vote in midterm elections. So the structural makeup of the coalitions right now gives Democrats an advantage in midterm elections and in lower turnout elections, which is new and different from my life in politics, at least.
Mm.
But it means that, as we go into the 2026 election, Republicans' job is going to be convincing a lot of the sort of MAGA coalition people who show up for Trump in 2016, who showed up for him in 2020, who showed up for him in 2024, but who are not reliable midterm voters, that they should come out and vote for a bunch of people who are not named Donald Trump. Um, I think that if we see a rift here where we see people who got engaged in politics because they believed in Trump, if they stop believing in Trump, the likelihood that they turn out for, you know, Susan Collins or for Lauren Boebert or for whoever non-Trump name is on the ballot, I think goes way down. It's already a hard problem for Republicans in the midterms to turn out this less engaged Trump supporting base. But if that base stops being Trump supporting, I don't know what cards that they have to play at that point, right? They'll go hard on their negative polarization and go hard on talking about how bad Democrats are, but it's a really steep hill that then would get a lot steeper. So I think that's the biggest implication that we would see. I think the other one that could be interesting is, as I said, Tom Massey and Ro Khanna have a bill that they're trying to move through. Special process in the House to force to the floor without the leadership's support that would require these documents to be made public. If we see a rift in the voting base, I think you'll start to see some elected Republicans perhaps not doing what the Trump White House wants, which again would be brand new for this party in the Trump
Sure.
era. And I'll believe it when I see it, and I'm not going to give them credit for things that they don't deserve in terms for willing to stand up. But you know, we have seen a lot of presidents have majorities from their own party that they couldn't control fully, that exercised oversight in ways that the White House would prefer not to. And that would be an interesting implication here too, is, if before the midterms, Trump starts losing some legislative fights in the House, and getting some oversight that he might prefer not to have. What do you
Mm.
think? Are there any other implications you think that there might be from a rift?
Well, just on that last point, I'm thinking about just the vote that was last week in Congress on budget rescissions,
Mhm.
where this was clearly painful for some Republicans in the sense that it wasn't just a budget vote on Trump's priorities. It was basically telling Congress to give up its budget powers to the president.
Right.
And so, there were some like Lisa Murkowski was like, this is really Congress's job. We shouldn't just be handing these over. She voted for it anyway.
Of course you
Um,
did.
but this is something that doesn't usually happen. Like, even when there's a very loyal House, or House or Senate majority on the president's side, they usually stand up for their chamber. They stand up for Congress, and they push back, and they really haven't with Trump all that much. I'm wondering if they might start doing that more if he's seen as like way more unpopular. If his MAGA base is not really there for him, I think another thing to think about here is, there's already going to be an interesting question thinking about 2028 about what
Yeah.
happens with Trump's base. And like, obviously, there's a number of people who want to run for president on the Republican side, what probably JD Vance, probably Marco Rubio, probably Ron DeSantis. I could think of a few others. And the main task for them probably at this point is, how do we win over Trump's people? How do we get the MAGA base on our side? And that's what they're thinking of. And so Trump's, at some point, these people go to someone else. But this could really be accelerating that. And if this group of people decides maybe they're just disgusted with the whole thing, they don't want to be involved with presidential politics anymore, or maybe they're not looking for a new Trump anymore, or it might just be a very different task to win those people over because of all this.
Yeah. I have been on the record for a long time that the 2028 Republican nominee will be named Donald Trump, probably Donald Trump Jr., if they can't change the Constitution. That, like, I think that you look at right now, the North Carolina Senate seat is open on the Republican side. Lara Trump said she might decide by November if she's going to do it, and she has frozen the field just with the
Mhm.
last name Trump that she married into. I don't think there's any way that Donald Trump Jr. looks at this and says, "Hey, I'm going to let somebody else take this," because I think if he announced he would win in a landslide, and I think he knows that. That's what I thought before the sort of MAGA Epstein rift. I'll be curious, if Trump starts to actually take on water in the Republican Party, does it give a non-Trump kind of person a leg up, right? Does it mean that a governor or somebody who is not seen as anti-Trump but who is orthogonal to Trump, are they able to get some real momentum in the 2028 fight if these folks start to move? But I think this is all pretty premature.
Right.
And some of
Right.
this is, of course, wish casting from people who don't care much for this
Right.
movement. That there's some blood in the water. But I think the interesting part on that blood in the water is, we've talked a lot about what Democrats should do in the Trump era, and I think this is a case of Democrats actually being pretty successful in driving these wedges and in gumming up the works and in doing a good job at making a scene here.
Yeah, actually, I wanted to ask you about that because there's been clearly okay. So there's this idea that when your opponent is destroying himself, you don't interfere, and I get the logic for that. But there's also, there are things that political parties can do to, draw. Like a good time to attack is when there is a rift in the other party, and to draw attention to that rift and to try and aggravate it. And to some extent, we've seen Democrats doing it. Now they're doing it from a lot of different directions with very different messages. But we were talking just before. You were mentioning that there's at least some legislative chicanery in the Congress
Yeah.
that Democrats have been doing along these lines.
Yeah, so we're having this conversation on Tuesday, the 22nd in the morning, and news broke overnight that Democrats have been trying to introduce in the Rules Committee bills that would force the administration to release the Epstein files. Republicans introduced a non-binding resolution saying that they should, but Democrats have been trying to push through one that said that they have to. And rather than take a vote against that, the Republicans on the Rules Committee have just adjourned and they're going home. And there were votes that were queued up in the House this week before the August recess that would have passed for sure on party line votes, and that now won't be able to, because rather than voting on against Epstein disclosure, voting for the White House, the Republicans on the Rules Committee have just decided to adjourn and go home. So, this
Sure.
is an incredibly successful legislative tactic because it stops the Republicans' agenda, it puts them in a spot, and it generated a whole bunch of news stories about how Republicans don't want to release the Epstein files, which is great political context for the Dems. And I think there's also a lot of people have been incorporating this in their speeches and in their social media and in their fundraising, and as you said, from a lot of different angles. And I don't think this is being driven by leadership in the Democratic Party, but it's
Mhm.
definitely, I think, a lot of individual members, John Ossoff in Georgia, has been really going for the jugular on this. There have been a lot of folks who are out there, making the Republicans sweat and making them, putting them on the back foot and making them defensive, which is great to see.
That seems smart.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I'm curious in terms of messaging. We've seen this in a few different ways. Some people are like, well, what if, AOC had some comments about, basically just saying this is sick. Others have said, Ossoff's been out there a lot saying, what do they have to hide? That sort of thing. One area that struck me as a potentially rich vein, and I haven't heard a Democratic leader say this specifically, but it would be something like, we have disagreed with Donald Trump about a lot of things, about a lot of his policies and his approaches and his insults. But the one way he has been a true breath of fresh air in our political system is that he doesn't believe in government secrecy. He believes that a lot of things that governments are normally very stingy about should belong to the people. He wants to just here's info on UFOs. Here's info on JFK. He'll give out national security secrets all the time. And in some ways, this has been really valuable. And here he is doing the exact opposite of the one thing that was really important, where he's just saying, no, I'm the government. You need to trust me now. Nothing to see here.
Mhm.
Um, that seems something that, that goes beyond, it goes beyond just Democrats who are never going to like him anyway. It's
Right.
beyond just the MAGA base who might be annoyed. Like this might capture maybe some independence on this.
Yeah, I think the angle that I've seen much more is like, "Hey, you guys elected a rapist. What did you expect?" Which,
Sure.
that's it's a blunt instrument, and I think I don't know how persuasive it is. I think that kind of language may turn off people who may be otherwise gettable. So yeah, I hope the Democrats try a lot of different things because I do think that like, different styles are gonna be benefit in different ways. And but yeah, I think that the Republicans are clearly terrified of this. They're on the back foot. They are willing to scrap a lot of things. But I also think, interestingly, they're not willing to take the negative votes, right? The idea that they would walk away from their legislative agenda rather than vote no on this is a really telling sign. We were talking a little bit about this before. It also, I think, is Mike Johnson put a bunch of folks he can't control on the rules committee, and I think
Mhm.
this is also a case of him. The kind of Republicans on rules 10 years ago, no matter what they actually believed, would have done what leadership told them to. Um, Now there are 4 or 5 votes that leadership can't control in rules, and you end up with this paralyzed Congress instead.
Yeah, I think this is
Yeah,
a moment where we've seen in the modern modern Republicans in Congress have paid a lot less attention to lawmaking and a lot more on signaling, on posturing, and so I've under prioritized things like the Rules Committee, which is very
yeah,
important for actually moving legislation. I think Mike Johnson is a reasonably capable leader, but I think that's an area he's under prioritized, and this is an area where that comes back to bite them.
yeah. I have a question for you. We haven't talked about the media angle on this.
Mm.
One of the big stories that came out here was the Wall Street Journal, and Trump freaked out, and he's been kicking them off of the plane and threatening to sue them and all sorts of stuff. What do you think the media angle is here? Do you think that there's actually a way that these stories are helping Trump? How should we think about the press's role on this?
So yeah, the Wall Street Journal story was interesting because it created like a 24 or 48-hour boomlet story about how finally the Wall Street Journal has given MAGA something to rally against. Because the obviously the major liberal organ of the Wall Street Journal
Right.
had
Rupert
was
Murdoch's,
going after
yeah,
Trump. They were claiming that this letter existed, but they weren't producing the letter, and so they were, and this was finally giving Trump a target. Now, the New York Times did this big story, I think it was yesterday, about how now MAGA is rallying and pushing back. They provided zero evidence for that,
mhm.
other than quotes from people who already like Donald Trump. Like, it didn't really tell us anything. So what evidence I've seen, and it's very rough, obviously, doesn't really suggest that that's moved people away from it. I did just this really rough little calculation looking at the number of stories about Epstein on both CNN and Fox News over the past week. CNN has covered it more, but Fox is still covering it. Even up to yesterday, they still had a number of stories on it. So this hasn't disappeared from the right by a long shot. Um, and but yeah, I'm actually curious to see, is that the only thing the Wall Street Journal has? My guess is it seemed like a very carefully worded article. I'm sure they expected to be sued by Trump. If that lawsuit goes forward, there's probably going to be a lot more embarrassing stuff for Trump in there. So we'll see how,
Yeah.
what happens on there. But that
I
could be a
mean,
very slow process.
Trump's threatening to sue is hardly newsworthy at this point. But
Right.
I read that story and I thought, well, there's no way that they don't have this letter, right? Like,
Right.
they're not publishing it? Are they waiting to, get a bunch of people on the record saying this doesn't exist and then they can drop it? Yeah. But again, this is a Rupert Murdoch owned paper, which I think is the most interesting
Right.
part of this story, right? The Wall Street Journal is hardly a liberal rag. It's not as state media as Fox News, but it's not that far off typically. So,
Right.
this
Right.
may be another sign of that rift that we've been discussing of people
I mean,
being willing to criticize them.
that's an area. The Journal is a place where like their news and their opinion divisions actually are still separate. And they do actually have very capable investigative journalists there. But yeah, it is surprising. This is like Rupert Murdoch knows what he's doing here. He knows the consequences of this sort of thing.
Yeah.
And you can almost see like maybe this is him sort of thinking about, well, who's the heir to Trump? Who should we be concentrating on next? This guy's getting tiresome. Or maybe it's just literally, like some good investigative journalism going ahead.
That he was unwilling to squash. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, since we're talking about prisons, let's switch to Bastille Day.
I was
That
wondering
works.
what the transition was going to be today, and that might be your best. That was great.
Am I correct that you recently did some Bastille Day
Yes.
themed
Yes.
pastries?
So we had a little Bastille Day party here at my house for my husband's family. I had not made anything for a while, and it's Minneapolis in the summer is spectacular. So I was in DC on actual Bastille Day, where it was so hot that I would have also torn down a prison and released 3 political prisoners. But we had a belated Bastille party, and I got to indulge my francophilia, and it was great. But the stone fruit is in season here in Minnesota, and it's just been spectacular. So, I made a whole spread, but the pastry part I was really proud of. I did an apricot tarte tatin that was phenomenal. My friend Kelly, who lives in my neighborhood, keeps bees, so I used her honey to make the caramel and put some phenomenal apricots down and made puff pastry myself, and it was really good. And then I made these little plum danishes. I used croissant dough and creme patissiere and some sugared plums to make some really phenomenal little pastries that went very well with vanilla ice cream. So
Nice.
it was a good time was had by all. Have you had any pastry adventures lately?
Well, a couple of things there. You mentioned the stone fruit season.
Mm-hmm.
There is right now we're in the middle of Palisade peach season in Colorado, and
Incredible.
Colorado is interesting because it's honestly for a lot of crops it's not a great growing terrain. Like it's dry. It gets colder at night. You have a relatively short growing season, but it is great for peaches. There's all these farms on the western slope that produce these magnificent peaches, and all over Denver this time of year you can find people selling just boxes of Palisade peaches, and you tend to think that's a really good idea. I'll buy a box of peaches, and then you have like 30 peaches in your house. You know what to do with them. So I often make pies.
Yeah.
You can make jams. They're fantastic. But I also wanted to mention, I recently drove. I'm back in Denver now. I recently drove here from Nashville just last week. It was mostly a pretty boring trip, but I did want to report. Last week I talked in our last podcast. I talked a little bit about kolaches, the Czech pastry that found its way to the U.S. and is all over Texas today and a few other places. I ended up in a really adorable coffee shop in Newton, Kansas, called Norm's Coffee Bar. I was just looking for a cup of coffee. This is about 20 miles north of Wichita. Not a big town. It's this really lovely, authentically hipster cafe, and they were serving kolaches there. So somehow the diaspora made its way there too. I want to give that credit. Definitely, this is one of the best places I've ever had food in Kansas. Now that's not Not the most amazing list, but I do give them credit.
My brother lives in Lawrence, Kansas, and there's a couple phenomenal bakeries in Lawrence. So
Okay.
we got to give our Kansas listeners a little bit of love there.
Here.
It's where the wheat comes from, so people do interesting things with it. So
yes,
that's great.
Thank you, Kansas, for the wheat. We would be terrible bakers without it. Well, I think that's a good place to call it for today. Thank you all for listening. Thanks, John, for a great discussion.
All right, talk to you soon.
Thank you for listening to this episode of Power and Flour. This episode was produced by Eli Maskett. We encourage you to follow and rate this podcast wherever you listen to it. Watch for new episodes at the end of each week.